Our title for tonight is The Final Journey. This is our last Acts class. We've had lots of them. I don't have an exact count. I lost count along the way. Somebody told me 18. I'm not sure, but between classes and sermons, we've had quite a few of them. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you guys just for your interest and attention through the series. It's been great. I know we've covered a lot. When I say this is the last Acts class, some of you are probably relieved, but I appreciate the interest and attention, and I appreciate the encouragement you've given me along the way. A lot of people have talked to me and expressed gratitude for the classes, and that's great. I'm especially grateful for the people who have told me that they've been studying the book on their own and things they're learning and coming and sharing new insights with me. That's been exciting, so I'm glad you've enjoyed the series and hope it continues to be a help to us. Okay, here's what we're going over tonight. We're going to look at the last and final journey that we read about in the book of Acts for the Apostle Paul and his traveling companions. We're going to take some time to look at Paul and his captors, which is interesting to see the interaction between them. This one will make sense when we get there. We're going to compare the carpenter fisherman with the tent maker sailor, and that's kind of a fun thing we're going to go over. And then we're going to look at the shipwreck that he goes through. We're going to look at his time on Malta, and then finally his time in Rome. So be opening up to Acts chapter 27, and we will jump in, and I'll share some final thoughts at the very end. So in chapter 27, starting in verse 1, it says, "When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some of the other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from, I'm not going to say that, Adriatium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Artarchicus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us." So they get on this ship to go to Rome, but Paul has a one-way, this is a one-way journey. All of his other journeys, he went out and came back, but this one is a one-way passage. It's interesting, this trip, and we're not going to read all the details of it, but this trip is if everything went smoothly and went well, this is a multi-month trip. Look at chapter 27, verse 12. You'll get the idea of what we're talking about. It says, "Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in," they were talking about a harbor they were trying to go to. He says, "Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there." You know, I don't know how many of you have ever been on a trip where you decided, okay, partway through the trip, we're going to spend the winter in a place that's not our destination. You know, for several months, we're going to stay there, and then when the winter's over, we'll take the rest of the trip. We just don't think that way anymore. But that's the way that this journey was going to go if it went smoothly, which it did not. One of the things to think about as we talk about this trip is this boat had 3 different classes of passengers on it. Now, when I'm talking about different classes of passengers, I'm not talking about like if you go on a cruise, where you have some people who are in inside cabins, some people that have balconies, and some people that have suites. No, not like that. They had sailors, soldiers, and prisoners. Those were the 3 classes on this ship. There's so many things that we take for granted in our life. And when you look at what they had to go through, even just in travel, you see that. I'll give you an example of modern travel. Both of our children live in Colorado Springs. And so Betsy and I probably 2-3 times a year go out there to visit them. It still amazes me. We can wake up and have breakfast in Colorado Springs and still have dinner in Gainesville at night. We have breakfast, we go to the airport, we get on a plane, we fly back, and we're here in time for dinner. And that's thousands of miles. It's something that we take for granted in our life, and yet even simple things like traveling from one city to another that were not much farther than that were ordeals back in the day. So Paul's going through a tough trip here. Let's talk a little bit about Paul and his captors. And when we talk about this, remember, Paul was a prisoner. I mean, that was his status on this thing. So, you lose sight of that as you're reading the passage sometime, but he was a prisoner on the boat. That was his role in things. But Paul won people over even as a prisoner because of his character. We find ourselves in all kinds of different situations, but character shines through, doesn't it? Sometimes, and maybe we're probably not prisoners, but we're in different statuses in life or whatever, but people see character. So it's really important how we live and what our character is like, because that'll help us break through with people. But let's look at some examples of how Paul won people over. Look in chapter 26, verse 32. It says, Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." I mean, this is a king who Paul was on trial in front of him, and after he listened to him, he said, we should be setting this guy free. Look at chapter 27, verse 3. It says, "The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs." I mean, here's a guy who's a centurion who's in charge of keeping the prisoners, and he says, well, this guy can go ahead and go to his friends so he can get his needs met. Amazing how he's already had an impact on this guy. Chapter 27, verse 42. I got to turn a page for that one. This shows you how the soldiers typically thought of the prisoners. After the shipwreck, it says, the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Saul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. We'll talk about that in context a little more later. But he saved all the prisoners because he didn't want Paul killed. Look at chapter 28, verse 10. After some interaction with the people on Malta, it says, they honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to set sail, they furnished us with the supplies that we needed. They didn't do that because of the sailors on the ship. They didn't do that because of the soldiers. They did that because of their interaction with Paul, which we'll read about in a little bit. But they honored him. Look at 28, verse 16. It says, when we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. So the other prisoners, I don't know what happened with them, but Paul, they let him set up housekeeping in his own place because of his character and who he was. And, they sent a soldier to watch him, but he got to live in his own place. And then in chapter 28, verse 30. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. So Paul had a lot of freedom because through his character and through his love, he won people over. And that's a great example to us that we should follow in the way that we live. Some of these people were converted, even people who were assigned to watch him. In Philippians 4:22, we're not going to turn there, but Paul says, the brothers in Rome send their greetings, especially the members of Caesar's household. So Paul goes there to get arrested, and after a while, there's disciples who are part of Caesar's household. I'm not exactly sure how all that worked out, but I'm sure he had something to do with it. And even those who weren't converted grew to respect him. We're not going to be able to reach everybody with the gospel, but we ought to have lives that are respectable, and people ought to view us in that way. So, he's a great example in that. Okay. Oh, that didn't quite fit on there. That's okay. Let's get into this thing about carpenter fishermen. In the beginning of the trip, we'll pick up in verse 27 where we left off before. Let's pick up in verse 8. Verse 9. It says, much time had been lost and sailing had already become dangerous because it was now after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in. So Paul, even though he's a prisoner on the ship, he's not a guy who's got standing on the ship. There are professional sailors on the ship, and he said he's given them sailing advice. Who does that remind you of? I mean, do you remember when Jesus told the apostles who were fishermen, "Hey, put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch"? Peter said, "Okay, look," he didn't say all this, but he's like, "Hey, I'm a professional fisherman and you're a carpenter, and you're telling me how to fish?" But here's the thing. Paul gives advice there in 9 through 12, but the Creator can give fishing advice, right? I mean, Jesus was God. He knew where the fish were. Now, thankfully, Peter listened to him, and he put down the nets, so Paul, who's a tent maker, is giving the sailors sailing advice, just like Jesus, the carpenter, was giving the fishermen fishing advice. Paul wasn't an expert sailor, although we'll find out later he did have some experience with shipwrecks. But Paul knew God. I mean, it pays to know the one who knows, right? And, God had revealed to him that that's not a good idea. He tries to pass it on, but they don't listen. Here's the thing. Paul was trying to protect them and help them. He wasn't just being arrogant. He wasn't a know-it-all. I mean, he's just trying to help them in their situation. But I think it's a funny interaction. Okay, but they go on they even don't listen to his advice, and they go ahead. Verse 13. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. It goes on and gives details about places they sailed past and that kind of stuff. This is a terrifying storm that they go through. It just gets worse and worse. I mean, by the time you get down to verse 20, it says, "When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved." I mean, they're in a bad situation. How many of you have ever been out at sea when the storm was so bad that you couldn't tell where you were and you couldn't see anything and you couldn't tell whether it was day or night? One. Okay. Two. That's a scary situation. I've not been in that situation, but I have been out at sea when it's pretty stormy, and it's not something I would care to repeat. But they're in that situation. In verse 21, Paul gives the guys some encouragement. Let's pick up there. I'm in the wrong chapter. Here we go. It says, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have saved yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel from the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.'" So, Paul gives them some encouraging news. They go a long way. If you looked at a map, and I meant to put one in here, but I failed to do it. They go from Cyprus all the way to the area of Malta during this time period. It's a long way, and it's a bad trip the whole time. They go a long time without eating or drinking. Listen to what it has to say here in verse 27. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. So they start taking soundings, and they figure out they're getting closer and closer to land. It's 14 days. Imagine going 14 days in a storm like that, where you're not in control of what's going on. It's pretty scary. Look at verse 30. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let down the lifeboat into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Things are starting to change here. The expert sailors are saying, we got to get out of here. So they just slide off to the front of the boat and they say, oh, we're going to go let some anchors down. But they're really trying to get in the lifeboat. The soldiers, who are not the ones in charge of the ship, now believe what Paul says. And so when Paul says, look, they've got to stay with the boat or you're going to be lost, the soldiers take matters into their own hands, take their sword, cut the ropes that are holding the lifeboat on, and it goes away. And so now they've lost their chance to get away. Verse 33. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. Anybody in here gone 14 days without food? Doesn't sound like fun to me. He says, you have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. That's a big ship. 276 people. Now, I don't know how many of those were prisoners, how many of them were sailors, and how many of them were soldiers, but that's a bunch of folks. Paul is essentially acting almost as the captain of the ship at this point. I mean, he's giving orders about who's going to eat. Go ahead and eat something. This is what's going on. He's not sailing the boat, but he's no longer somebody that they're ignoring. They're listening to him. It gives some details about how they do this. At daylight, they try to get ashore, but the ship gets stuck on a sandbar and runs aground, and the stern gets broken to pieces by the surf. Pick up in verse 42. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. So they all get there. They had to stay with the ship. They decided not to kill the prisoners, but they all make it ashore. So now they're in Malta. Malta's an interesting part of the story. It says, once they were safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. Now, this is interesting to me in particular because my wife's family heritage is from Malta. Her father's parents were born in Malta. And so one of these days we're going to go there. We haven't been there yet. But one of these days we have to go see this place. It says the islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper driven out by the heat fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, the picture of this is amazing. When they saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, this man must be a murderer, for though he escaped the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up and suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Well, that's a pivot. There, verse 7, there was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him after prayer, placed his hands on him, and healed him. When this happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. You know, there's a lot of ways you can tell the scriptures are authentic. If you're going to make up healings to put in a book to impress people, you don't pick dysentery. That's all I'm saying about that. You know, you'd have healed him of something else besides that. But, you know, Paul heals all the sick people on Malta. That's why they honored them. They provided them everything they needed to sail when the time came. So it was an impressive thing that happened there. So they have a great time on Malta. And then it's on to Rome from there. It's interesting. Paul had always had a desire to go to Rome. He talks about this in Romans chapter 1, verse 11 through 13. So he's going to Rome, but I have a feeling this isn't what he had in mind. I have a feeling he didn't have in mind to go as a prisoner. And yet he's going to Rome. You know, that's kind of the way it is in life. Sometimes God fulfills what we want or need in ways that we don't expect. And sometimes great things still get done in that process. And that's how it was with Paul. Let's pick up in verse 14, because there's a few interesting things here that go on. In verse 14, it says, it gives the name of some cities they go to, and they finally arrive. And then in 14, it says, then we found some brothers and sisters who invited us to spend a week with them. And so we came to Rome. The brothers and sisters there had heard we were coming, and they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. At the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. When we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. So it's a great scene when Paul gets to Rome. A lot of the brothers and sisters come out to greet him, and they're so excited to see him. They come from various towns around the area, and they greet him, and they bring him in, and they provide a place for him to stay, and he's treated very well. And Paul really is encouraged by this. Then Paul, in verse 17, it says, 3 days later, he called together the local Jewish leaders. When they had assembled, Paul said to them, my brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. He says, I've asked to talk with you. Look at verse 21. They replied, we have not received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of our people who have come from there has reported or said anything bad about you. But we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect. So it's interesting to me that, Paul sends for the Jewish leaders who come out to meet him, and he's expecting them to be mad at him or to be upset with him, because he's faced a lot of criticism and persecution from the Jews. And yet they said, "What? We haven't heard anything bad about you." But they're very aware of Jesus. I think that's really important. The reason I think that's important is the message of Jesus traveled more than the news about Paul. Sometimes in the way that we go about things, we can make the message about us. That wasn't the way it was. They knew about Jesus. They didn't know anything about Paul and the controversies surrounding him. So Jesus was the main focus of the story that was being spread, not Paul. So Paul goes on and, he teaches them and explains to them about the kingdom. Some of them listen to him, but others do not. Eventually after it's kind of interesting in the earlier parts of Acts as we read along, a lot of times it said initially Paul went to the synagogue. And then after they didn't listen to him in the synagogue, he would go to the Gentiles. Well, in this case, he was under arrest, so he couldn't go to the synagogue, so he had the synagogue come to him. But the outcome was the same. Some of them were persuaded, some of them wouldn't listen, and at the end, he quotes the prophet Isaiah, and he says, look, if you guys won't listen to me, I'll go to the Gentiles, they will listen. The last inspired part of the story is in verse 30. It says, for 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. That's how the book of Acts closes, is with Paul sharing his faith. There's a lot of parts of the story that we're curious about, but Acts doesn't tell us the very end parts. We know some of those things from history. There's controversy about some of those, or differences of opinions about details. But we do know some things about history. But this is how the book ends, is with Paul in his house preaching to anybody who would listen. And I think that's a great way for things to end. I wanted to share some final thoughts as we close out the series on the book of Acts. One is there's a lot more to learn. I know we've had a lot of classes on Acts, but honestly, we've kind of scratched the surface on a lot of things. And so I hope you'll continue to study the book, go back and read things in detail, because I'm telling you, there's half a dozen things to learn from the book of Acts for every one we've talked about in the class. So there's plenty more to learn from the book. The second thing is, I think the book closes the way it does because their lives are what mattered the most. The things that we read about in the book are the most important parts. And so, that's what we should focus on. There are some things in history and tradition that are helpful to know. According to history, and again, there are different records and they aren't always in agreement, but Paul was in prison for several years in Rome. There was a period of time where Paul and Peter were probably imprisoned together, not necessarily in the same place, but they were in prison at the same time. Most people believe that it was during the reign of Nero that Peter and Paul, who are the most prominent figures in the book, were put to death during the persecution of Nero of the Christians, which was probably somewhere around 64 or 65. 64 is when that persecution started. We don't know exactly when they were executed, but it was sometime shortly after that. So that's when it was. It's interesting. Paul was shipwrecked here in Malta, in the passages that we read. But interestingly, when he wrote to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians, he said he had been shipwrecked 3 times when he wrote the book of Corinthians. The one that happens in Acts is after that. So, Paul had some expertise as far as shipwrecks were concerned. He'd been through a bunch of them. That's just kind of the way it was when you sailed a lot, I guess. There was a lot, but there's a lot of history about them at the end period. You can read about, if you want to read more about that period of time, you can read Fox's Book of Martyrs. That has some information. But there's a lot of historical information about Nero and the things that he did. They eventually, Paul was put to death. I want to read a passage out of a book. You can tell how old this book is. I think I got this book when I was 17 years old. So that's been at least a year. But I always loved this passage at the end of the book. And this guy takes, the guy who wrote this book, John Pollock, he fills in a lot of gaps and takes poetic license with some things, and he dials in on a particular version of the history. So, again, this is not inspired, but it's an inspiring reading, I think. Of Paul's final trial, nothing is known beyond a tradition that he was condemned by resolution of the Senate on the charge of treason against the divine emperor. How long Simon Peter and Paul were in prison together before being executed the same day as early and strong belief asserts cannot be fixed, possibly as much as 9 months. The date honored in the city of their martyrdom is June 29th, 67 AD. Peter nailed to a cross as a public spectacle at Nero's circus on the Vatican, head downward at his own request, and Paul, as a Roman citizen, beheaded in a less public place. The ancient tradition of Paul's execution site is almost certainly authentic, but the details cannot be fixed. Whereas Christ's Via Dolorosa may be followed step by step, Paul's remains vague. He would have it so. And because Christ had walked that earlier road, Paul's was no Via Dolorosa, for they were walking it together. Thanks be to God, who in Christ always leads us in triumph, and through us spreads the fragrance of the knowledge of him. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. They marched him out through the walls, past the pyramid of Cestius, which still stands on the Ostian way toward the sea. Crowds journeying to or from Ostia would recognize the execution squad by the lictors with their fasces of rods and axe, and the executioner carrying a sword, which in Nero's reign had replaced the axe, by the escort and by the manacled criminal walking stiffly and bandy-legged, ragged and filthy from his prison, but not ashamed or degraded. He was going to a feast, to a triumph, to the crowning day to which he had pressed forward. He who had often talked of God's promise of eternal life in Jesus Christ could not fear. He believed as he had spoken. All God's promises find their yes in him. No executioner was going to lose him the conscious presence of Jesus. He was not changing his company, only the place where he enjoyed it. Better still, he would see Jesus. Those glimpses on the Damascus Road in Jerusalem, at Corinth, on that sinking ship, now he was going to see him face to face, to know even as he had been known. They marched Paul to the third milestone on the Ostian Way, to a little pine wood in a glade, probably the place of tombs, known then as Aqua Salvi, or Healing Waters, and now as Tre Fontaine, where an abbey stands in his honor. He is believed to have been put overnight in a tiny cell, for this was a common place of execution. If Luke was allowed to stay by his window, if Timothy or Mark had reached Rome in time, the sounds of the night vigil would not have been of weeping, but of singing, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as dying, and behold, we live. At first light, the soldiers took Paul to the pillar. The executioner stood ready, stark naked. Soldiers stripped Paul to the waist and tied him, kneeling upright, to the low pillar, which left his neck free. Some accounts say the lictor beat him with rods. A beating had been the usual prelude to a beheading, but in recent years had not always been inflicted. If they must administer this last senseless dose of pain to a body so soon to die, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or sword? I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the flash of a sword, the glory. The brothers and sisters in Acts are our teachers, they're leaders, they're examples. We have a lot to learn from them. I hope as we've read the book, you've made new friends, new traveling companions to go through life with, because that's what the book is intended to give us. And I want to close with one final verse to read in Hebrews. in Hebrews chapter 13. And we'll pick up in verse 7. Remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Thanks again for your time and attention with the book of Acts. It's been a great study for me. I hope it's been helpful to you, and take a lot with you into the new year from it. Amen.